We are gathered on the occasion of the International Day for the Universal Access to Information, which comes at a time where Lebanon has tangibly sensed and fallen victim of the lack of transparency and the rampant corruption which has spread all over our country's public institutions. On October 17, 2019, the Lebanese people have taken to the streets after having finally understood how much corruption has affected their daily lives, their economic situations, and their standards of living. But it wasn't until the 4th of August that the Lebanese people have actually realized how directly corruption can hinder and threaten their survival. This is why this panel, titled Access to Information and Anti-Corruption in Lebanon, is of great importance and will help shape the future that our country holds. Here to talk about this topic with us today are four very esteemed panelists with a very strong and deep understanding of this topic. Please join me in welcoming His Excellency, Member of the Lebanese Parliament, George Okeis, who is with us at the studio today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Celine.
We also have with us today Mr. Arkan el-Seblani, who is the Chief Technical Advisor and Head of UNDP's Regional Anti-Corruption and Integrity Team in the MENA region, and also an inspiration for me to getting into this field of fighting corruption. Also, thank you for joining us.
A great pleasure to be here.
Okay. Our third panelist is Mr. Michael Jelenic, who is a policy analyst at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD's government unit. And last but not least is Mr. Badri el-Mouechi, who is the president of the Lebanese Transparency Association, which is the local chapter for Transparency International in Lebanon. Thank you for taking the time to share with us your views and expertise on those two very important topics, which we will be discussing throughout this panel. Now, we know that the law for the right to access information was adopted in 2017. However, studies have shown that the implementation of this law hasn't been quite what we have expected. I would like to start this panel with Your Excellency. I know that you've been following up on the path of the right to access information law, and since its adoption in 2017. Now, my question to you will be addressed in Arabic, since you will be talking about legislation. حضرتك تقدمت بكذا تعديل للقانون الحالي. بالإضافة كمان بنعرف هلا إنه كمان صار تبنت الحكومة كمان المرسوم التطبيقي لهيدا القانون مؤخرا، وكمان صار في يعني شفنا بعض المبادرات إن كان من رئاسة الحكومة لتعيين موظفين معلومات وإلى ما هنالك. فحضرتك كيف بتشوف هيدي التعديلات بتأثر على تطبيق هيدا القانون وبالإضافة يعني للمرسوم، وشو فيك تقلنا كمان عن أهمية هيدي الخطوات بتعزيز الشفافية بلبنان، وخصوصا هلا من بعد ما شفنا انه في كتير من الاموال الطائله اللي عم بتفوت على لبنان، ونحن بحاجه لشفافيه كرمال نقدر نكون عم ناخذ يعني مثل عم نستبق الامور ونجيب نقلل من امكانيه الفساد بهيدي المرحله.
اولا سيلين، اسمحي لي اشكر مؤسسه ميشيدياء واليونسكو على استضافه هالحدث وهاللقاء، وعبر عن سعادتي اني مشارك مع 4 اشخاص بيمثلوا جهات تعني لي كثير على الصعيد الشخصي وعلى الصعيد النيابي، جهات اللي منا دولي مثل UNDP والOECD اللي بفتكر من أكثر الجهات اللي عم تدعم لبنان وعم تدعم مسيرة الإصلاح بلبنان. وعلى الصعيد المحلي كمان ال LTA شريك أساسي بكل ما له علاقة بمكافحة الفساد وتحديدا بحق الوصول للمعلومات، وعم بواكب جهودهم ومساعدتهم لإلي كعضو بلجنة الإدارة والعدل مسؤول عن هذا القانون وعن إقرار التعديلات اللي فيه. وأكيد ما بنسى حضرتك بمبادرة غربال اللي هي شريك من المجتمع المدني، بفتكر لعب دور ريادي بالإضاءة على مكامن الخلل في تطبيق قانون حق الوصول للمعلومات من تاريخ إقراره بال 2017 لليوم. وكنتوا فعلا يعني ويسل بلور مثل ما بيقولوا، وكل الدراسات اللي عملتوها هزتنا ونتائجها يعني كانت صفعة لنا كلنا كمشترعين وقانونيين انه في شيء غلط لازم يتصلح. بفتكر ايضا لازم اقول انه انفجار 4 آب هو يمكن كيس ستادي على كيف ممكن الفساد وعدم الوضوح والضبابية وعدم المشاركة بالمعلومات وعدم وضوح قنوات انسيابية المعلومات بين الجهات ممكن يودي إلى كارثة من الحجم اللي صار ب4 آب. وأظن أنه اليوم اللي عم بيسأل نحن بشو بالنا عم نحكي بقانون حق الوصول للمعلومات وهالقد وضعنا بلبنان صعب، ردي الأول عليه هو أنه هيدا الوقت تحديدا للحديث عن هذا القانون. ولأنه صار معنا هيك على مدى 30 سنة من حوكمة الإدارة بالدولة بطريقة غير شفافة، بطريقة لا تتيح المحاسبة الشعبية على سلوكية كل السلطات سواء تنفيذية أو تشريعية أو قضائية، هو اللي وصلنا لهون. وبفتكر أنه الخطوة الأولى اللي لازم نعملها كلنا هي أنه نرجع نحط هذا العنوان، عنوان حق الوصول إلى المعلومات والأكسس تو انفورميشن على الطاولة بشكل جدي ولمرة نهائية، ونقر كل التعديلات اللي كلنا اتفقنا عليها ونحيلها إلى الهيئة العامة للمجلس النيابي لإقرارها بأقرب فرصة، ويبدأ لبنان ساعة إذن بتطبيق حقيقي وفعلي للاتفاقية الدولية لمكافحة الفساد اللي انضم لها من سنة 2008، ولكن ما قدر ياخذ الخطوات أو منع من اتخاذ الخطوات المناسبة من قبل سلطة سياسية كلنا عم نشوف انعدام الثقة فيها سواء من الشعب اللبناني أو من المجتمع الدولي. باختصار تما أخذ دور غيري وردا على سؤالك، لأني بفتكر عملت مقدمة شوي طويلة مش من حقي بس كانت لازمة. التعديلات اليوم اللي اشتغلنا عليها هي تعديلات سحب الذرائع فينا نسميها أمام كل أجهزة الدولة كلها دون استثناء، من رئاسة الجمهورية لمجلس النواب للحكومة لأي إدارة، سحب الذرائع بشكل كلي نحو عدم تطبيق هذا القانون. وأتت هذه التعديلات اللي اتفقنا عليها بجلسة بلجنة فرعية أنا ترأستها ب 23 تموز 2020 لحتى تكون يعني هيك التشيري اون ذا توب اللي بتخلينا نقول انه نحن استكملنا المفروض فينا نعمله كسلطة اشتراعية. إذا بتحبي فوت بتفاصيل التعديلات بفوت هلا، أو إذا بدك تاخدي راوند من المشاركين
لا
أنا ما عندي
مشكلة.
مشكلة.
نحكي عن
طيب.
شوي عن التعديلات.
اللي بدي أقوله أولا إنه بالشكل هي أول مرة بنعلن بمؤتمر أو علنا بنعلن عن مضمون التعديلات، وأنا برأيي يعني تدليلا على أهمية هالبانل حبيت إني أذيعهم لأول مرة. وبرجع بقول إنه عنوان هالتعديلات هي سحب الذرائع من أمام أي جهة رسمية تريد أن تعطل أو تتهرب من تطبيق هذا القانون. قلنا فإذن أولا أنه أعطينا صفة ومصلحة لكل طالب معلومة. 2 قلنا أنه الجهات الرسمية مش تمتنع حكما عن، يجوز لها أن تمتنع، وربطنا امتناعها بتوفر تناسب بين الحق المراد حمايته وبين حق الناس بالحصول على معلومات. وبعطي مثل عن الكوفيد 19 أنه أساسا المعلومات الصحية الشخصية هي مشمولة بالسرية ولا يمكن الوصول لها، ولكن حرصا على السلامة العامة وقت يكون في مصلحة وطنية عليا تسقط الحماية الشخصية. هيدا كمان تعديل هام جدا. شفنا أيضا خلال المرحلة السابقة من تنفيذ القانون أنه كانت كل جهة تتزرع أنه في سلطة وصاية فوقها. قلنا أنه يجوز للمؤسسات العامة تحديدا أن تعطي المعلومات دون الحاجة إلى الرجوع إلى سلطة الوصاية، وهيدا كمان يسحب ذريعة كتير كبيرة كانت تعطل تنفيذ هذا القانون. من التعديلات أيضا الهامة جدا أنه أعطينا الحق بالطعن مش فقط أمام الهيئة الوطنية العليا لمكافحة الفساد، أعطينا الحق للقضاء العادي سواء قضاء عدلي أو قضاء إداري عند قاضي الأمور المستعجلة سواء أمام القضاء العدلي أو القضاء الإداري، لحتى نوسع مروحة الجهات التي يمكن لها أن تبت بالطعون المقدمة من أصحاب العلاقات. فإذن باختصار القانون اليوم في حال أقر مع تعديلاته أصبح يعني ممكن أساسي enabler لحتى ننقل السلطة العامة في لبنان من ضفة إلى ضفة، من مرحلة إلى مرحلة. وبرأينا وبرأي العديد من زملاء النواب أنه هذا القانون قانون حق الوصول إلى المعلومات يوازي أهمية قانون مكافحة الفساد في القطاع العام وإنشاء الهيئة الوطنية لمكافحة الفساد، لأنه هودي الركائز الأساسية اللي من دونهم ما فينا لا نحكي عن تعزيز شفافية في القطاع العام ولا نحكي عن مكافحة الفساد. لأنه كيف ممكن نفكر بأنه نحن عم نكافح الفساد في القطاع العام إذا ما في أكسس للمعلومات تمكن المواطن، قادة الرأي، الإعلام، المجتمع المدني، الجهات الدولية من الوصول إلى كل المعلومات بانسيابية وشفافية.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. So I really liked the way you expressed when you expressed by saying that the proposed amendments will help eliminate all of the excuses which were previously used by public administrations, and we have heard from various public administrations while trying to implement this law through sending out information requests, which claimed that which use those excuses in order to avoid disclosing some information and in order to avoid the implementation of this law in general or some specific provisions of this law. Thank you so much for this information. I would like to move forward with Mr. El-Seblani. Mr. El-Seblani, you have spent the last 15 years fighting corruption all over the world, especially in the MENA region. And from your experience, having been through all the struggles Lebanon has faced in its earliest steps in fighting corruption, which has finally led to the adoption of the National Anti-Corruption Strategy in the country, in addition to its action plan. How important do you think having a national strategy is in moving forward with the anti-corruption agenda and taking this agenda to the next level, especially such a strategy which doesn't just focus on legislation, but also focuses on corruption prevention through sectoral approaches, and in which you have chosen pilot sectors with high risks of corruption. I would like you to talk a little bit about that.
Thank you so much, Celine. I would like to join His Excellency in thanking the Merhej Foundation and the UNESCO for hosting this important discussion. I think at times of crisis and like the ones that Lebanon is facing, the talk about governance and accountability and anti-corruption becomes very critical, because the crisis that Lebanon is facing, whether it's the fiscal crisis or the economic crisis or the post-Beirut explosion crisis, are crises that are at their core governance crises, and not simply humanitarian crisis or development crisis. That's why it's very important for the discussion in Lebanon to bring focus on these issues. To answer your question, I think in a country that has come out from civil war back in 1989, 1990, where everyone talks about corruption, and there is corruption, and we need to fight corruption, it can be shocking that up till 2020, so 30 years after, there was no single document, single plan, single vision written on anti-corruption, which shows that the gap between public debate and public policy. So the step of developing the strategy on its own is a first step, a very belated first step, but still a first step, and a good one, because the strategy in its process and in its content includes the key elements that can help the country move forward. The challenge, of course, is implementation, is perseverance, is the ability to produce results that people can feel. With that in mind, this brings me back to the issue of access to information. Access to information is part of the strategy, and the work that has been done in the past few months has also been critical to move this agenda forward of access to information, because access to information is not only related to anti-corruption, it's related to human rights, the freedom of expression, the ability of people to acquire and share information, which is critical for accountability, but also beyond that, critical for building trust in a country where trust is a very valuable and very rare commodity. So from an anti-corruption point of view, Lebanon has, the discussion even until today overemphasizes the criminal law as a tool to fight corruption. And that's very important, but it's not the only tool. And it certainly cannot work in the absence of an enabling environment at the political level, at the legislative level, and then at the implementation level, but also at the societal level. And the strategy tries to tackle these things, tries to tackle these different levels through targeted work. And in the UN and the development community in general, there has been several references to this strategy. We were part of the supporters of the development of the strategy, and we are now supporting its implementation. I want to conclude my answer to your question by saying that by tackling these different levels, the opportunity to make progress becomes higher, because fighting corruption in countries where institutions are weak, where there is very little trust in society, cannot happen just through law enforcement. It needs to happen through reforms. Unfortunately, in the absence of a government, in the absence of clear political commitment, tangible commitment to anti-corruption, the chance of making progress is limited. However, even with that limited space, the strategy creates this opportunity to make even some progress, awaiting stronger commitment by the new government, hopefully sooner than later.
Thank you so much, Mr. El-Seblani. I noticed that you said that this strategy includes key elements to move forward. However, the challenge still remains in implementation. Now, how likely do you think that this strategy will be implemented by the successive governments to come?
It's a very good question, and I am really, not in a position to, I don't have a crystal ball, really, that I can look into and say. But if the history is any indication, then, I would say that there are big challenges. However, the difference between now and the past is that unlike the past where anti-corruption was a general title and a broad title that everyone interpreted like they want. You are corrupt, no, I am corrupt, he is corrupt, it was like that. Now, by tying the anti-corruption agenda to specific targets, we can test political will more concretely. So political will is with the adoption of this strategy is no longer abstract or general. It is tied to specific things, the procurement integrity agenda, the banking secrecy, the asset declaration, the illicit enrichment, the access to information. And notice all of those don't exist in the Lebanese system. Or if they do exist, they are bad texts. It's not only about bad implementation.
Yeah.
So the key pillars of an anti-corruption system, beyond the penal code or criminal code, are absent in Lebanon. Conflict of interest management, effective asset declaration system. Access to information is just starting. Whistleblower protection is not yet there. So I'm just giving you several examples of key pillars that are missing, that the strategy puts in perspective and basically creates the test. Political will means two things: pursuing these commitments and making resources available for their implementation. Whether that will happen or not, only time will tell. But what we can be sure of is that the United Nations is in a position of advocacy and support to these important targets for Lebanon.
Thank you so much. So I think that what you said really highlights the importance of having such a strategy which will help put the political will to the test, since we've been hearing a lot about a lot of politicians claiming that they are fighting corruption and that this is on top of their agendas, but we haven't seen any concrete results in this regard. And I would also like to emphasize on the fact, on something that you've said, which is very important, and that is it is not just about having the right legislation and the criminal law, which will actually help us fight corruption in Lebanon, but it is actually a set of tools other than the criminal law, which will help in fighting corruption. And this will only happen through the right reforms, which are tackled in this strategy, like you've mentioned earlier. Thank you so much. Mr. Jelenic, can you hear me?
I can, thank you.
Okay, now knowing that the OECD, along with other international organizations, have been investing in fighting corruption in Lebanon, and after having launched the OECD's cooperation with Lebanon on good governance more than a year ago, what can you tell us about the progress that has been made in this regard in light of all the upcoming events which has happened earlier this year?
For sure. I really appreciate the question, and I appreciate the feedback given by my esteemed panelists, especially the issues raised about the importance of access to information generally, as well as the specific implementation challenges it suffers in Lebanon at the moment. But if I may just begin, just to give you a bit of perspective, we've seen access to information grow across OECD countries over the past 20 years, even over the past 30 years. Back in 1980, only 20% of OECD countries had such legislation in place. Today, all 37 OECD member countries have these laws in place, and what we find is that they are crucial to ensuring accountability within government. They give citizens a means to participate in policy making. They can be a crucial tool in fighting against corruption, as was mentioned by the previous panelists. And it can really play a key role in strengthening public institutions, especially in the context where we've seen evidence of challenges to these public institutions through COVID, through the recent explosions in the port of Beirut. But what I will say is this: having the law in place, as other panelists have rightly pointed out, is not the panacea to all of the challenges, and a lot of these fall into the implementation. Our evidence in supporting these policies suggests that the adoption of access to information laws, in and of themselves, does not necessarily lead to more transparency, nor does it necessarily make governments more accountable. As such, ATI is a necessary but not sufficient condition to leading to those outcomes. And our work at the OECD seeks to address a number of the internal and external factors that can make access to information more successful in a country context. And that's drawn on a very deep historical trend, as well as a broad trend across countries. From an internal perspective, some of the issues that we look at are the effects of having the strong monitoring mechanisms in place. And these mechanisms can help us know whether the disclosure of information is being properly and correctly implemented. Likewise, our recommendations seek to understand the financial and human resources that are necessary to implement a law. Having ink on paper is one thing, but having the resources necessary to bring it to fruition is certainly another. We also look at putting in place the adequate mechanisms to build capacities, both on the supply side of the government to respond to requests, but also on the demand side of citizens, NGOs, and the media to make these requests. Finally, we would say that developing the right information management systems is something that's very necessary to take place in order for information to be collected, centralized, and then disseminated on a proactive and reactive basis by obliged institutions. In addition to these internal dynamics, our support is also based on the idea that we take into account larger external contextual factors which need to be considered. First is baseline citizens' trust in institutions. What we can find is that we're starting from a level of mistrust in general. We might find that the same mistrust exists in the information that is subsequently provided. And that's something we need to be aware of. Likewise, we need to be aware of having the right political will and leadership, as the other panelists completely said correctly, because this is what's going to support the access to information in its implementation phase. We also need to take into account how stakeholders function in this environment, what sorts of access they have, how empowered are they, what skills do they have, and what skills do they need to better access this supply of information. We need to make sure that the demand meets the supply. And finally, I would say that understanding the power of civic space is incredibly important. And that includes not just understanding what laws and implementation arrangements ensure a space for citizens to voice their concerns, but to also understand the threats to it. And these include very real issues related to mis and disinformation, which we see across countries. Now, coming to the particular context of Lebanon, and perhaps I could close with this, but the OECD's support here has started over a year ago in terms of providing support for Lebanon's good governance agenda. And that's focused mainly on 3 pillars. The first is access to information. The second is open government reforms more generally. And the third is support for better understanding the role that public communications can play in intermediating, for instance, access to information with open government. I won't repeat the amazing progress made to date in a very challenging context. Obviously, the passage of the Access to Information Law and the subsequent adoption of the anti-corruption strategy and legislative framework are excellent steps forward, as is the action plan and implementation decree for anti-corruption. So thanks to this progress, the law is now unequivocally in effect. But going forward, and drawing on some of those challenges I mentioned to you earlier, we're doing what we can to work with UNSAR, the UNDP, and other international partners to ensure the appropriate uptake of this legislation. And that includes working on these training and capacity building activities to support the implementation action plan. This includes developing an access to information handbook, which guides public officials in the obliged public administration how, when, in what manner they can disclose some of this information, as well as helping UNSAR itself in developing the terms of reference for an access to information e-portal, which will function to more proactively engage the obliged administrations in providing the information. So those are our general support for access to information. I'll close briefly by mentioning that we believe it's equally important that this is taken in a larger open government approach. In this regard, the OECD is releasing an open government scan in cooperation with the government of Lebanon, which seeks to provide a roadmap, concrete and actionable steps forward that the government can take, not just in access information and transparency, which are very important, but in other reform areas related to integrity, accountability, and stakeholder engagement. Supporting this is the work we do on public communications. The idea is that public communications can be a tool for government to better enhance their dialogue with citizens to begin with. And the surveys that we have started in this seek to inform ongoing work. But let me stop here. I would just say that I think that the momentum so far has been strong. The challenges with COVID and governance are very evident, but this provides the motivation for not just the OECD, but the entire international community to continue supporting the very excellent reform efforts that have been proposed thus far and have taken place thus far. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jelenic. And I would really like to emphasize on a point which you've mentioned regarding creating a demand for this information from citizens in order to initiate more disclosure from public institutions. And I think the more demand we create, the better implementation we will have. In addition to that, you have mentioned something very important which will help us move on to our next speaker. You have talked about the function of other stakeholders other than the government when it comes to access to information and the skills that they have and what they need. In this regard, I would like to talk to our fourth speaker, Mr. Badri el-Mouechi, who is representing one of the main stakeholders in this this topic, which is a civil society organization, the Lebanese Transparency Association. Being one of the civil society organizations which have been putting all of its resources into enhancing transparency and fighting corruption in Lebanon for more than 10 years now. And in light of the lack and the absence of the oversight bodies, what role do you think civil society organizations have been playing in transparency and in accountability as tools to fighting corruption?
Well, first of all, thank you to MCF and to UNESCO for organizing this panel discussion, a very important discussion that needs to be had and ongoing. There's a lot of space for civil society in Lebanon today. Thankfully, we're one of those countries where civil society is active. And there has been a lot of work going on. Just to focus on this specific theme of access to information, I can give you three concrete examples of how civil society has been involved in pushing this agenda forward. For example, if we go back to 2009, when the draft law on access to information was presented to Parliament, it was presented as a consequence of exemplary cooperation between 17 different NGOs, including LEPAC, which are the Lebanese members of Parliament against corruption, which were headed by Ghassan Khaibir. And they, in effect, worked very hard to develop a draft law, which was then introduced to Parliament. Unfortunately, under the system that we're living in, it took 8 years for that law to be approved, or that law, but with modifications, of course, to be approved by Parliament in February 2017. And that says a lot about what Arkan was talking about, which is the lack of political willpower, the lack of perseverance to make these things happen. And we can go into why there's a lack of political willpower, but I think that many of us who are living in Lebanon at least understand very well why there's a lack of political willpower. But that's one example. Another example under this theme of access to information is more recently to develop the implementation decrees relevant to this law. In effect, the draft implementation decrees, which were developed by the previous Minister of Justice, Albert Serhan, were quite frankly not up to the mark. And civil society, LTA specifically, did a review of those implementation decrees and presented those reviews to the following Minister of Justice, Najm. And why the Ministry of Justice? Because they were responsible for developing the implementation decrees. We presented the review of these decrees to the more recent Minister of Justice, which has also now resigned. Many of our remarks and observations were adopted, and the decree was endorsed around 6 weeks ago and published in the official gazette around 1 week ago. So, as Michael was saying, we actually now have, because of these decrees, a mechanism for implementing this specific law. But the challenge, as has been said by every panelist here, will be in the actual implementation. It's very good to have implementation decrees, but if the law is not implemented, well, it's useless. A third example of civil society involvement in this theme specifically is with one of our fellow panelists today, His Excellency Member of Parliament, in effect, who was tasked by the Parliamentary Committee on Administration and Justice to review any amendments to the law. We in effect did a full review of the law around 3 months ago, which included all the recommendations of His Excellency Member of Parliament Okeis. And in that committee that was working with him was also, along with LTA, also was Ghassan Khaibir, who has been a pioneer in this from the very beginning. So now we're waiting for this law or the amendments to this law to be approved by Parliament. As a general note, your question being what is civil society doing when it comes to anti-corruption, when it comes to accountability? There are several things we can do. First of all, we need to be aware of what are the priorities, because corporate governance, governance in general, is like we say in corporate governance, it's not a destination, it's a journey. And you're always working towards that that destination, you're always in that journey. And the question is, in that journey, what are your priorities? And access to information is a key component of that, because you cannot have accountability, you cannot have transparency without access to information. And so what can civil society do in general, not only in the field of access to information, but on the other themes of anti-corruption, whether it's independence of the judiciary, whether it's asset declaration and illicit wealth, whether it's the development of independent regulatory bodies within each key sectors of the country's economy, whether it's the implementation of the national anti-corruption strategy, whether it's the proper functioning of the newly approved, also this summer, anti-corruption commission. You know, in all of these, there's an important role for civil society to play. First of all, to identify these issues, to advocate for them, to lobby for them, to be a constructive element in pushing forward this agenda. So it's not just about complaining, it's also about participating in the development of solutions to these problems that we face. Once laws have been approved, it's about working on the implementation of these laws. So whether it's in supporting in developing the decrees, or whether it's supporting in capacity building in different public administrations to enable them to implement these laws, or whether it's playing a watchdog role to see how these public administrations are then implementing these laws. In all of that, there's an important role for civil society to play, and we try to do this to the greatest extent possible in a collective way. And I gave an example earlier of how we try to do this collectively with other NGOs, because there's no way that one NGO is going to change a country as complicated and, quite frankly, messed up as Lebanon. We need to work collectively, we need to work together, and I'm glad to see that, in fact, in this panel, we see some of these stakeholders who've been working together, whether it's UNDP or whether it's members of parliament, whether it's LTA or Gherbal or Merhej Foundation. We see there is collective action on the ground, and we need to amplify that, because this is how, and this is my final point, this is how we're going to create that key element of pressure. We, as Arkan himself often says, politicians do not see the light, they feel the heat. And we need to make those politicians, or those leading politicians, because it's not fair to paint all of our politicians in one black brush. There are some positive elements in our political elite that we need to work with, but for those who are not working with us, in fact, we need to be able to apply pressure on. And this is how we're going to convince them, in effect, sooner or later, that it is in their interest to pursue such reforms. Because today, they do not see that as in their interest. Why has it taken so long for so many reforms to take place in them? It's because they don't see it in their interest to implement such reforms. And this is our challenge, I think. This is our challenge, is to set the stage for enough pressure to be on them, not only locally, but also with our partners internationally, and with all the governments who are willing to help Lebanon with technical and financial aid, to work together to apply that pressure on those politicians which are in effect blocking our key reforms that we need.
Thank you so much, Mr. el-Mouechi, for this intervention. And I do have to agree with you on the point you've made about creating and developing this kind of pressure and giving incentives to politicians in order to implement the reforms which the people, civil society, and all of the Lebanese citizens have been asking for. You've also given many examples about how civil society organizations and your organization have been involved in the development of the Access to Information Law and in the drafting of the implementation decree on the Access to Information Law, which takes me to my next question to Your Excellency. سعادة النائب، أنا بعرف إنه حضرتك وقتها كنت عم توضع التعديلات على قانون الحق بالوصول للمعلومات اعتمدت مبدأ التشاركية مع مؤسسات المجتمع المدني، منها Lebanese Transparency Association ومنها كمان مبادرة غربال وجمعيات أخرى. إذا بس فيك تخبرني شوي عن أهمية هذا المبدأ بالتشريع وبوضع السياسات العامة بلبنان.
يعني تجاوبك على سؤالك بدي هيك علق تعليق بسيط على اللي قاله أستاذ معوشي، إنه لازم نحط ضغط، وأنا معه، إنه مسؤولية وطنية جماعية إنه يكون في ضغط للوصول إلى بيئة مكافحة للفساد. بس هيدا الضغط يعني ما بيعطي فعله بشكل كبير وملموس إلا إذا كان في ناس داخل المؤسسات وتحديدا داخل مجلس النواب قابلة لهذا الضغط أو حتى مواكبة له ومادة إيدها لكل هذه الجمعيات لتتشارك هي وياها بالتشريع الأفضل اللي بيكافح فعلا الفساد واللي بي يعني يغير نمط وسلوكيات السلطات الحاكمة في لبنان. كرمال هيك يعني الانتخابات شغلة مهمة جدا، وكرمال هيك تحسين نوعية ممثلي الشعب أمر هام جدا. ووقت اللي ينكتب بكل دساتير العالم الشعب مصدر السلطات، ما بفتكر هيدا يعني مجرد بيت شعر، هيدا نتيجة تراكم خبرات تاريخية عبر السنوات بتثبت انه كل ما احسنتي اختيار ممثليكي كل ما كانت فرص التغيير اسهل. بموضوع التشاركية اللي عم تسأليني عنه، بدي اعترف واقول انه هذا المجلس النيابي الحالي اذا كان له من ميزات، وما بعرف أركان بيعرف هذا المجلس وبيعرف المجالس اللي قبله، بس إذا كان في هذا المجلس من ميزات جديدة تفاضلية هي اعتماد بعض أفراده وبعض لجانه وبعض مقرريه على رأي المجتمع المدني. وكمان بدي ذعلك يعني خبر جديد آخر خلال هالندوة، هي إنه أنا الأسبوع القادم يعني سأقدم اقتراح قانون جديد عن المشاورات العامة، عن البابليك كونسلتيشن، وأكيد تمت صياغته بالشراكة مع عدد كبير من الجمعيات والمنظمات المعنية. من خلال هالقانون البابليك كونسلتيشن عم نحاول أيضا يعني نوضع ضغط على السلطة التشريعية في لبنان أيا يكن أعضاءها، وعلى السلطة التنفيذية أيا تكن وأيا يكن شكل الحكومة، أنه يعني يتشاركوا مع المعنيين، مع المين ستيك هولدرز بالقوانين وبالمبادرات التشريعية اللي بيقدموها، سواء كانت على شكل مشاريع قوانين أو على شكل اقتراحات قوانين. ما بعرف إلى أي مدى رح يكون في تلقف من قبل باقي النواب والكتل، بس انه على الاقل يعني بكون عم بعطي معنى اضافي لولايتي النيابيه، انه على الاقل قدمت وسجلت رسميا في امانه المجلس النيابي واودعتها كمان ضوء جديد لتعزيز الشفافيه في اداره القطاع العام والرجوع إلى رأي المعنيين، سواء المتخصصين بهذا الميدان أو ذاك، أو يعني الذين يعنيهم هذا التشريع. يعني أنا وقت بدي أعمل تشريع عن الصحة، أكيد نقابة الأطباء ونقابة الصيادلة وكل الجهات الشبيهة يجب أن يكون لها رأي في هذا التشريع، وإلا بنكون يعني عم ننقص قيمة إضافية لجودة التشريع ولملائمته. هذا الأهم. إذا يعني تعطيني بعد دقيقة لأختم بكل اللي سمعته، إنه الموضوع اللي عم نحكي فيه اليوم واللي جمعنا يعني اللي هو اليوم العالمي لحق الوصول إلى المعلومات، أنا بفتكر عندنا مشكل في لبنان هو مشكل ثقافي، وتجربتنا في تطبيق هذا القانون بيّنت أنه عندنا مشكل ثقافي بمدى قبول فكرة أنه السلطة العامة تشارك الناس بالمعلومات اللي بحوزتها، وهيدي بدها ميراث وبدها تراكم من الخبرات منا بين ليلة وضحاها. وبفتكر كل اللي موجودين بهالبانل شركاء بتعزيز ثقافة التشارك بالمعلومات. المشكلة الثانية عندنا هي مشكلة الثقة، وشفنا من 17 تشرين لليوم وتعززت ب4 آب مشكلة ثقة المواطن بكل مفهوم الدولة، من المختار إلى رئيس الجمهورية. كل شخص يحوز على صفة عامة اليوم أو على وظيفة عامة، بدل ما يكون مصدر أمان للمواطن مثل ما مفروض يكون بأي دولة ديمقراطية أخرى، هو متهم. يعني هو عليه أن يجهد يوميا لإثبات أنه هو بريء من تهمة أنه متولي صفة عامة. أعتقد أنه القانون مع التعديلات اللي أقريناها هو رح يشكل جسر، إن شاء الله ما يكون هش ويرجع ينهار عند أول محك، يكون جسر متين نحو استعادة الثقة. الأمر الثالث، المشكلة الثالث، أنه نحن هذا القانون، ومش عم بالغ بإعطائه أهمية منا عنده إياه، بس أنا أعتقد أنه هذا القانون يعزز مفهوم الديمقراطية. أنا لهون بدي أوصل، أنه القانون، كل قانون يقرب بين الشعب وممثليه هو قانون يعزز مفهوم الديمقراطية، اللي نحن أول كلمة بدستورنا هي كلمة لبنان جمهورية ديمقراطية برلمانية. فإذا أكيد وقت اللي الحكومة عم بتكون ميني مجلس وعم بتكون صورة مصغرة عن المجلس، وأنت سألتي أركان أنه كيف تتوقع حيكون تلقف الحكومة لتنفيذ هذا القانون، جاوبك جواب مهم جدا، أنه أنا ما عندي بول دو كريستال تأعرف شو بده يصير، بس أنا بقول لك أنه it depends على شكل الحكومات. إذا بدنا نستمر بنهج حكومات سياسية ميني مجلس نوليها السلطة التنفيذية، ما حدا رح يحاسب حدا، وما حدا رح يطلب معلومات من حدا، وكله رح يخبي على بعضه. فمهم جدا انه نحط الاسس اللي بتخلينا نخرج من هذه الحلقة المفرغة، ونقدر نرجع نتخيل انه لا، بلبنان يجوز ان يكون هناك نظام ديمقراطي فعلي فيه معارضة وفيه موالاة، والمعارضة تمطر الحكومة والموالاة بطلبات جدية للحصول على معلومات. من أحد أهم ميزات التعديلات اللي أدخلناها واللي أركان بيعرفها وأستاذ بدري بيعرفها، إنه ألغينا شيء اسمه الصفة السرية عن العقود التي تجريها الدولة. يعني أنت شفتي مثلا بقصة منا بعيدة، قصة فضيحة سوناتراك، عقد موقع بين الدولة وبين شركة موردة للمحروقات، أعطوها هيك اعتباطيا لهذه الاتفاقية صفة السرية. لا، هيدي مش خاضعة لمزاج الإدارة العاقدة أو للوزير أو للمدير العام. لا يعتد، كتبنا بالنص بصراحة، لا يعتد ببنود السرية في العقود التي تبرمها الدولة. من حق كل مواطن، من حق كل تاكس باير يعرف كل قرش عم بيدفعه وين عم بيروح، لمين عم بيروح، إذا بالقناة الصحيحة. أنا آخر المداخلة بحب أدعيكم، سواء LTA سواء غربال، إنه تكملوا your monitoring and measuring exercise على التعديلات، يعني على أمل إقرار هذه التعديلات. أتمنى أنكم تكملوا جهودكم بدراسة مدى تنفيذ، لأنه الامبلمنتيشن ايشو هي الاساسيه انا برايي. بس نحن اليوم وفي وافقني اركان والاستاذ بدري انه بفتكر بالرود ماب اللي انرسمت بجهودنا جميعا اصبح عندنا نص ونص جيد، اصبح عندنا استراتيجيه واستراتيجيه قابله للتنفيذ. اليوم تركيزنا كلنا يجب ان ينصب على اجبار السلطه والاداره والوزاره والحكومه على تنفيذ كل هودي، وتكونوا انتم الصوت الصارخ في حال ما نفذوا.
Thank you so much for this intervention. I think the proposed law, which you have mentioned, the law on public consultations, is very important and will help in creating pressure on politicians and public officials and will force them to, I think it's very important to have a law that will force them to cooperate with stakeholders and that will engage other experts on the topics and on legislations that will directly affect their lives. And
we surely need a lobbying mechanism to
Exactly, and I think it is very important to re-enhance democracy nowadays in Lebanon, especially that our freedom of expression is being violated, and also our democracy in general is facing a lot of violations recently. I would like to move forward to Mr. Seblani and ask you a question. Do you think that the National Anti-Corruption Strategy, in the form in which it was adopted, is still as viable in light of the current people's demands and lack of trust in public institutions, which are supposedly the ones responsible to implement the strategy? I mean, in other words, when we see people in the streets saying that they do not trust the public institutions anymore and they have lost all trust in them, how do you think that moving forward with the strategy will be, and how do you think that that the people will accept those public institutions to be the ones that will implement the National Anti-Corruption Strategy?
Thank you, Celine, for the question. I was really enjoying the comments and inputs provided by all the panelists. I want to just emphasize the point that Judge His Excellency MP Okeis was making on public consultation. I think this is an excellent initiative. I was a panelist recently in a webinar that is discussing this particular point with the Lebanese Oil and Gas Initiative and the organizations that were behind this, again, civil society organizations that are pushing the envelope on a daily basis. And I think that's really great. I think in addition to the fact that it's reinforcing for democracy, in addition to the fact that it is about inclusion, it's also an early safeguard against corruption. Because corruption is not only about breaking laws. Sometimes it can be embedded in the law itself. So when you engage stakeholders, experts, from the beginning, you are able to have an advanced front in the fight against corruption to make sure that the laws and the policies are not made in a way to benefit a particular group or to create vagueness, unnecessary complexity, which can create all these incentives for corruption and loopholes for corruption. I wanted to highlight that point, which gives an additional importance, and I'm sure it's in the mind of everyone, but I wanted to really highlight that in the discussion today. On the question of the strategy, let me first say that no, it's not true that only public institutions are responsible for the implementation of the strategy. That there are different things that need to be done, and civil society also has a role. But I want to go back to this issue of, which I feel is a bit simplistic in saying that, oh, the public institutions are bad, so how can they fight corruption and implement? The only way, I mean, short of a revolution that changes everything, right? Which I'm not the judge on whether it is needed or not, will happen or not. But I'm just saying that in the absence, the only bet is to reform the institutions, is to work, just like there are, and Okeis mentioned it, and Badri mentioned it, there are good people everywhere. In parliament, in public institutions, in ministries, in civil society, there are good people and bad people. So ultimately, it's about really creating the alliance with those who want to make change. And the good thing that the strategy does, there are two good things. One, it creates a space for people to come together. They're not coming on general ideas or, abstract concepts. They're coming, it's a space with concrete frameworks, with concrete targets, indicators, etc. So one, it's creating the space for those change makers to come together. That's first. Second, it is creating clear things that need to be achieved. Now, is the strategy the silver bullet to corruption? Of course, no country in the world can claim that they have eradicated corruption. It's a process, like Badri said, it's a journey, good governance and anti-corruption. This strategy is sort of an itinerary to that journey. And every time we reach a milestone, there will be another milestone after it. So it's a continuous struggle. So the strategy does those two good things. First, creating the space for these change makers to come. Second, creating specific goals that could be achieved. Now, will the strategy, like I said, solve everything? I mean, we can discuss that. But at the same time, it is evident from the content of the strategy that it does identify the key issues that need to be addressed in Lebanon. One, the major legislative gaps that exist in terms of text, such as conflict of interest or asset declaration, or in terms of implementation, such as access to information or whistleblower protection. It talks about civil service integrity. It talks about procurement integrity, independence and effectiveness of the judiciary, independence and effectiveness of the oversight institutions, particularly the Central Inspection and Audit Bureau, the role of civil society and the enabling environment for civil society, and last but not least, taking the anti-corruption agenda from the general to the specific through the sectoral approach. So those 7 areas in the strategy are very much welcomed by experts in the field because, in a way, they help clarify, bring more concreteness to the debate on anti-corruption. From that point, I end by saying that it is really not up to me or to anyone to say that this will be a success or not. What we can say is that the elements of success, some of them are there, some of them maybe are not. We talked about several things. It's the challenge for all of us to build on what exists and to continue the struggle to bring to existence what doesn't exist so far. Thank you again for the question.
Thank you. I really think that creating the space for people with integrity is something which we have been talking about a lot lately. And I know that former MP, Mr. Merhej, has talked a lot about creating this alliance between stakeholders and people who have actually been putting a lot of effort in taking the anti-corruption agenda forward. And
it's the integrity mafia.
Yes.
Not the corruption mafia.
And I think that, as you said, the National Anti-Corruption Strategy is very important because if you don't set your goals straight, you will never be able to know how to achieve those goals. And I think it's very important to make it very clear exactly what we want to achieve. Thank you so much. I would like to conclude this panel by saying that even though the image is a bit dark and the circumstances in Lebanon are not very are really disturbing, and in light of all of the this political turbulence, I think it is good to see a lot of effort being put, whether it is effort being put from members of parliament, from the international organizations such as the UNDP and the OECD, and the work that is being done by civil society organizations in order to create this pressure from within the institutions, and working with government officials in order to implement the laws, in order to draft those laws, and in order to act as a watchdog and hold the public officials accountable for their actions. I would like to thank you all for joining us, and thank you all for your input. Thank you to our panelists who have joined us on Zoom. Thank you so much, and thank you for our viewers also for tuning in.